On the 7th of May, 1945, General George S. Patton sat across from Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower in a German mansion near Frankfurt. The momentous news of Germany's surrender had just reached them a few hours earlier, and American soldiers were celebrating throughout the streets. Yet, there was no celebration for Patton. He had come to deliver a message to Eisenhower that would irreversibly change the course of their friendship. A message that would eventually lead to Patton's removal from command within mere months. The idea he would present was one that Washington and the media would soon deem insane. "We're going to have to fight them eventually," Patton said in his direct manner. "Let's do it now, while our army is intact, and we can win." But Patton wasn't talking about the Germans. He was talking about the Soviet Union. Eisenhower sat frozen, his gaze fixed on Patton. Only days earlier, the Allies had fought side by side with the Soviets to defeat the Nazis. The American public adored Uncle Joe Stalin, and the media had portrayed the Red Army as heroic liberators. Now, Patton, alone in his assessment, proposed attacking this very ally, an action that would break the fragile alliance and cast him as a radical in the eyes of the American political establishment. "George, you don't understand politics," Eisenhower responded, his voice betraying the weight of the decision. "The war is over. We're going home." Patton looked at his commander and, in that moment, realized something terrible. Eisenhower, despite being well aware of the Soviet threat, was not going to take any action. The quiet between them spoke volumes. Eisenhower understood that Patton was right, but feared the political consequences of such a confrontation. What followed was one of the most consequential silences in American military history. Patton had seen what others refused to acknowledge. He had recognized the Soviet Union as a totalitarian empire, not a temporary ally, but an expanding threat that would soon impose its will on Eastern Europe. While the American political establishment and its media partners turned a blind eye, Patton had witnessed firsthand the horrors of Soviet occupation in the territories they had liberated. He had seen Soviet forces occupying Eastern Europe with brutal methods that shocked even the most hardened American soldiers. Patton's intelligence officers reported mass rapes, looting, and summary executions of civilians suspected of anti-communist sentiments. Entire populations were being forced into Soviet labor camps, while the Soviets dismantled German factories, shipping entire industrial plants back to Russia. In one of his many dispatches, Patton wrote to his wife, Beatrice, "I have no particular desire to understand them, except to ascertain how much lead or iron it takes to kill them." To Patton, the Soviet threat was no abstract geopolitical concern. It was a reality that he had witnessed on the ground. As he traveled through liberated areas, he saw the devastation Soviet occupation was leaving in its wake. It wasn't just about the brutality, it was about the future. Patton knew the Soviet Union's reach was expanding, and he feared the long-term consequences for Europe. In April 1945, Patton's assessment became even clearer. He met with American prisoners of war who had been held by the Soviets. Their stories were horrific. The Soviet forces had stolen their personal belongings, and any resistance to Soviet authority was met with violence. Officers who protested the inhumane treatment of prisoners were beaten or executed. These men's experiences only reinforced Patton's view of the Soviets as an emerging enemy, one that had to be confronted before they grew stronger. But Patton's warnings fell on deaf ears. While the United States and its allies had just defeated Nazi Germany, they were unwilling to confront the rising power of the Soviet Union. The political machinery in Washington was already preparing for a different kind of peace. As the world celebrated the end of the war in Europe, no one seemed willing to consider that the next threat would come from within the alliance itself. Patton, ever the strategist, developed a detailed military plan to attack the Soviet Union before it was too late. His reasoning was starkly logical. The Red Army had just lost 27 million men fighting the Germans, and their forces in Eastern Europe were exhausted and overextended. American forces, by contrast, were at their peak strength. They had complete air superiority, intact supply lines, and morale was high. Patton argued that the Soviets, stretched thin and demoralized, could be defeated within 6 weeks. Patton's military strategy wasn't just theoretical. He based his argument on real intelligence. The Red Army, despite its impressive tank production, had suffered from years of continuous warfare, and its machinery was beginning to break down. Soviet tanks were mechanically unreliable, and their logistics were weak. Meanwhile, American tanks, though less heavily armored, were reliable and available in overwhelming numbers. The key advantage, Patton believed, lay in the Soviets' fragile morale. Many Soviet soldiers had been told they were fighting to defend their homeland. But now, after the German threat was neutralized, many of them had no interest in occupying Eastern Europe. If the Americans pushed east, Patton believed, large numbers of Soviet soldiers would desert or surrender. And he proposed something no one in Washington was prepared to hear. He suggested arming the Germans. There were hundreds of thousands of former Wehrmacht soldiers who would rather fight the Soviets than be sent to prisoner camps. This idea, though brutal and clear in its logic, horrified Washington, especially in light of the recent defeat of Nazi Germany. The American public, fresh off a long war, was not ready for a new military confrontation. Patton's proposal to arm German soldiers was seen as an affront to the sacrifices made during the war. Moreover, the U.S. government had just begun the process of denazification and had no intention of rearming former Nazi soldiers. Eisenhower, who had led the war effort in Europe, was not willing to risk his reputation for a confrontation with the Soviet Union. The political dynamics of Washington further complicated matters. President Harry Truman had just assumed office and was following the policies set by his predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Truman was committed to working with Stalin, believing that the Soviet Union could become a cooperative partner in post-war Europe. For Eisenhower, supporting Patton's idea meant not only going against the Soviet Union, but also defying the post-war vision of a peaceful Europe that the Allies had worked to establish. Eisenhower's refusal to support Patton was rooted in both political calculation and personal ambition. In the aftermath of the war, Eisenhower was a national hero, widely praised for his role in defeating the Nazis. To advocate for a military confrontation with the Soviet Union would have been political suicide, jeopardizing his future career, possibly even his presidential ambitions. Eisenhower's strength as a leader lay in his ability to hold the Allies together. Patton's idea represented the ultimate betrayal of that unity. By the summer of 1945, the press began to turn on Patton. His comments about the Soviet Union were leaked to journalists, and the media narrative began to shift. Once hailed as a brilliant strategist and commander, Patton was now painted as a warmonger. The New York Times, Time magazine, and other outlets questioned his mental stability and his ability to adapt to peacetime leadership. The media chose to ignore the reality that Patton had accurately observed the growing Soviet threat. Eisenhower, under pressure from Washington, finally removed Patton from command on the 28th of September, 1945. Officially, it was due to his controversial comments about denazification, but everyone knew the real reason. Patton refused to stop warning about the Soviet threat. He had spoken out at a time when most leaders were unwilling to acknowledge what was happening in Eastern Europe. Patton's relentless voice had become too much for the political establishment to bear. After his removal from command, Patton spent his final months trying to document the Soviet atrocities he had witnessed. He wrote letters to Washington, warning of the Soviet Union's expansion and predicting a future military confrontation. His letters from October and November of 1945 read like prophecies. He understood that the Soviets would continue to dominate Eastern Europe, spreading communism across the continent. He urged the United States to prepare for a military conflict that was inevitable. On the 9th of December, 1945, Patton's life took a tragic turn. He was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim. His staff car was struck by a truck, and Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. He died on the 21st of December, 1945, just 12 days later. The circumstances of his death have fueled conspiracy theories ever since. The timing was suspicious, and many believed that the man who had been silenced for speaking uncomfortable truths was now permanently quieted. Though Patton's death was ruled as a tragic accident, the timing of it, so close to his prophetic warnings, has never sat well with some. It is tempting to think that he was silenced because he knew too much, but no credible evidence has ever emerged to support claims of assassination. It remains a haunting possibility that Patton was a casualty not only of the war, but of the political realities that followed it. Patton's warnings were vindicated in the years that followed. By the middle of the 20th century, the Soviet Union had consolidated its control over Eastern Europe, establishing puppet regimes in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The United States, meanwhile, had to confront the Soviet threat on a global scale. The Cold War, which Patton had predicted, lasted for 45 years, costing trillions of dollars and millions of lives. Looking back, it is clear that Patton was right. He saw the Soviet threat before anyone else in power would admit it. And he proposed a solution when it was still possible to act. But his warnings were ignored, and the moment of opportunity passed. The Cold War would continue for decades, with the United States and its allies locked in a tense standoff with the Soviet Union. In hindsight, the question of whether Patton's plan would have worked is impossible to answer. What is undeniable, however, is that his voice, silenced at the time, was prophetic. The Soviet Union did expand. It did consolidate power in Eastern Europe, and the Cold War that Patton foresaw did come to pass. Patton's legacy lives on, not only as a brilliant military commander, but as a man who saw the future more clearly than most. His life serves as a reminder that sometimes the truth is too uncomfortable to be heard, and when it is spoken, it is often too late to act. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the world had experienced the full extent of what Patton had warned about. His predictions had come true, but the question remained, what if he had been listened to in 1945? Could the Cold War have been avoided? Could millions of lives have been spared? Patton's story is a tragic one. He was a man who understood the necessity of confronting threats when they were vulnerable. Yet, in the end, he paid the ultimate price for speaking out. The lessons of his life continue to resonate, and his voice echoes through history as a reminder that sometimes the truth is silenced by the politics of the moment. Patton's final days were spent in a state of reflective isolation, and the irony was not lost on him that he had been removed from command for speaking uncomfortable truths about the Soviet Union, only to be vindicated by history. His warnings had been deemed politically untenable in a world desperate for peace, but as time wore on, the very reality he predicted took shape with frightening accuracy. His fate was tied to the broader failure of strategic vision in Washington, where the priority was appeasement and public opinion rather than confronting an emerging threat. By the time Patton was removed from command, the Cold War was already beginning to take root. As Soviet forces tightened their grip on Eastern Europe, the American public, weary from the horrors of war, had no stomach for another fight. The prospect of military confrontation with the Soviet Union was unthinkable in a mighty time when many had lost loved ones and seen their lives shattered by the war. But Patton saw the larger geopolitical puzzle, one that was far from over. He believed that if the Soviet Union had been confronted while it was exhausted, fractured, and stretched thin, it could have been dealt with in a way that might have spared the world decades of tension, espionage, proxy wars, and countless lives lost. In the wake of Patton's removal, Eisenhower's political calculation proved to be correct for the short term. He solidified his reputation as the great peacemaker. He skillfully navigated the political landscape of post-war Europe and continued to build America's global image. But the shadows of the Cold War were already beginning to form. The tensions between the superpowers simmered beneath the surface, even as American and Soviet leaders exchanged pleasantries. It wasn't until later that the full scale of the Soviet threat became undeniable, and by then it was too late to stop the inevitable clash between East and West. Patton's tragic accident, just 3 days after he submitted his final assessments to Washington, left his predictions unanswered. The car accident that paralyzed him marked the final chapter of his life. The accident was officially ruled as a tragic mishap, but the timing, so close to his final warnings, sparked suspicion that his death was somehow connected to the broader political machinations at play. The loss of Patton silenced a voice that had dared to speak uncomfortable truths. A man who had been so certain of his own righteousness was now gone, leaving the world to grapple with the consequences of ignoring his warnings. As his funeral took place in December of 1945, with his body laid to rest alongside his soldiers in the American cemetery at Luxembourg, the world was beginning to turn its eyes toward the future. The Soviet Union was strengthening its position in Eastern Europe, and the stage was being set for the Cold War, a confrontation that would last for decades. Patton, however, had already provided the blueprint for dealing with the Soviet threat, but it was too radical, too far ahead of its time, for anyone in Washington to take seriously. Years later, Patton's warnings would be echoed by others. Churchill, who had shared Patton's concerns about the Soviet Union, would continue to warn the West of the danger of Soviet expansionism. By the late 1940s, Churchill's warnings about the Iron Curtain dividing Europe became an iconic phrase that defined the Cold War. Yet, even with the evidence mounting, it wasn't until the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and the building of the Berlin Wall that the United States fully recognized the extent of the Soviet threat. The irony of Patton's position cannot be overstated. His military genius, his understanding of strategic opportunity, and his willingness to speak out against the rising Soviet threat were all overshadowed by the political realities of the time. Washington's refusal to act on Patton's intelligence, his strategic assessments, and his military plans led to the long, drawn-out Cold War. Patton had identified the enemy and proposed a solution, but the political system was incapable of moving past the short-term considerations of appeasement and public opinion. The consequences of Patton's silence and the political suppression of his ideas were felt throughout the Cold War. As Soviet influence spread across Europe, the American public came to understand the gravity of the situation Patton had foreseen. The military confrontations in Korea, Vietnam, and later Afghanistan were all rooted in the geopolitical realities Patton had warned about. The United States was forced into a series of proxy wars and diplomatic standoffs, all while the Soviet Union strengthened its grip on Eastern Europe, Asia, and beyond. Patton's vision of confronting the Soviet Union before it grew too powerful was never realized. The failure to act when the opportunity was ripe has been viewed by many historians as a pivotal moment in the trajectory of the Cold War. The lesson, however, wasn't lost on future military and political leaders. As the Cold War dragged on through the 50s and 60s, the policies of containment and diplomacy were tested and found wanting. Patton's call for military action, though extreme in the context of the moment, was validated by history, albeit posthumously. Even after his death, Patton's reputation as a brilliant strategist continued to grow. The military community, especially within conservative circles, regarded him as a visionary. His unwavering commitment to confronting threats head-on, regardless of the political cost, became a touchstone for future military leaders who sought to emulate his directness and courage. Figures like General Douglas MacArthur, who faced similar frustrations with political leaders during the Korean War, would cite Patton's foresight and his willingness to speak out as a model for military leadership. Patton's story also serves as a reminder of the cost of political pragmatism. Eisenhower, though brilliant in his ability to navigate the political landscape, failed to recognize the long-term dangers of the Soviet Union's expansion. His reluctance to confront Stalin, combined with his desire to maintain political stability, ultimately left the world vulnerable to the communist threat that Patton had seen clearly. Eisenhower's commitment to diplomacy and political alliances, though admirable, failed to account for the realities of Soviet power. In his attempt to avoid another war, Eisenhower inadvertently set the stage for one that would last 45 years. In the aftermath of Patton's death, the Cold War continued to unfold as he had predicted. The Soviet Union solidified its control over Eastern Europe, and the Iron Curtain that Churchill had described became an unbreachable reality. By the late 1940s and early 50s, the world saw the rise of communist regimes in China, North Korea, and Vietnam, further validating Patton's assessment of the global threat. The Korean War became the first significant military confrontation of the Cold War, and Patton's warning about military confrontation with the Soviet Union was echoed by future leaders, including President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Patton's death in December of 1945 marked the end of an era. The man who had been the loudest voice warning of the Soviet threat was gone, but his warnings lived on, in the words of those who came after him. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the Cold War was drawing to a close, but it had taken nearly 50 years of conflict, billions of dollars, and millions of lives to reach that point. A point Patton had predicted back in 1945 when the Soviet Union was at its most vulnerable. Looking back, Patton's legacy is one of foresight, courage, and sacrifice. He was a man who saw the future more clearly than most, but his voice was silenced by political necessity. Had Patton been listened to, the Cold War might have been avoided, and millions of lives spared. Instead, the world was forced to confront the Soviet threat in a much longer and more devastating conflict. The questions raised by Patton's story continue to resonate today. When should the United States confront emerging threats? How do we balance the need for military action with the political realities of international diplomacy? Patton's answer was clear: confront the threat when it is most vulnerable, even if it is politically inconvenient. The consequences of not doing so are long-lasting and devastating. Patton's story is not just a historical curiosity. It is a reminder of the high stakes of military leadership and the importance of speaking uncomfortable truths, even when those truths are ignored or dismissed. His voice, though silenced in his time, continues to echo in the strategic decisions that shape the world today. The lessons of his life, his death, and the Cold War that followed are as relevant now as they were in the mid-20th century. They remind us that the world of diplomacy and war is rarely black and white. and that the most difficult decisions often come at a great personal cost.